Welcome everybody that is just joining us. We're happy to have you for our Board 101 training today. Folks are trickling in, so we'll give about just 30 more seconds and then kick us off.
All right, I know we have a lot to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. And of course, there's someone blowing leaves right outside my window, so I hope that you don't hear that in the background here. I'll do the best I can to talk over that. Thank you all so much for coming today. I'm Lauren Kugler, the Executive Director of the Community Foundation of the Gunnison Valley. We have with us today Scott Krieger, he'll be facilitating the session and just welcomed you all a moment ago. Betsy Dittenber with the Chaffee County Community Foundation. We are co-hosting this event with our neighbors over Monarch Pass. We have Will Edwards, who's an attorney here in Gunnison County, and one of his specialty areas is nonprofit law. Maryo Ewell, who is our Director of Community Impact here with the Community Foundation of the Gunnison Valley. And Kelly Sudderth, who is a CPA and the Chief Operating Officer for Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, based here in Gothic in Gunnison County. And thank you for taking time out of your day today. And especially thank you for being interested in being a good board member. Whether it's something that you're diving into for the first time or you have been on boards for quite some time, we appreciate all the time you give generously to the various organizations in our communities. I hope that you get a lot out of today's session, and always feel free to provide us with feedback or ideas on what would be useful for you as board members or staff members. I know we have staff members on here as well. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Betsy.
Thank you, Lauren. And hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. To echo what Lauren shared, it's really great to see invested board members out there trying to do the best they can in their roles. And we're so appreciative of this partnership that we have with the Gunnison Valley Community Foundation so that we can really maximize the resources that we have out here in the mountains for our nonprofit community. So thank you for being here and for allowing us to be part of this. And with that, I'll pass it over to Scott.
Thank you, Betsy. And to kick us off in today's session, we will start with Will Edwards. Take it away, Will.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Lauren. My name is Will Edwards. I'm an attorney here in Gunnison. I work with a lot of nonprofits on issues like tax exempt status, starting up, and then sort of governance and compliance. And today I'm going to talk about legal duties of nonprofit board members, which I know is, probably everyone's favorite topic. So start off with, go over what we'll go over here. And, first question is, what is a duty? And then who do nonprofit members or board members owe their duties to? Who can enforce these duties? I've got that parenthetical statement in case anyone's a grammar nerd is going to give me a hard time. What are the duties? And then sort of what are the duties in plain English, and how do you make sure that you're fulfilling them? Like, what are the specific actions that you can do to fulfill your duties, right? So duty is just a legal obligation that you owe to someone else, and you're bound to do it, and someone has the right to sort of enforce to force you to do it, right? So it's something you have to do, and you can get in trouble for not doing it, right? So important stuff. And you owe the duties to the organization itself. If you have voting members, you probably owe those duties to the members of your organization as well, and then to the general public, right? Because we don't get charitable status for nothing. This is sort of the trade that you get to be a charity and have things like tax exemption because you're serving a public purpose and because you owe duties sort of to the public to do a good job of running your nonprofit. So then this is, you can enforce it. This is, maybe some, I put this in here the first year, and you can look at this list, but I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Okay, so what are the duties? Getting down to it. So they're found in law. They're found both in case law, sort of, common law, and in statutes, right? The written law passed by the legislature. In Colorado, you find it in the statute that nonprofit directors and board members, right, must act with good faith, care, and in a manner that the director reasonably believes to be in the best interest of the organization, right? And that's mirrored sort of in fiduciary duties, which maybe you're more familiar with from other contexts, right? And a fiduciary is a person having a duty created by his or her undertaking. So here, like by agreeing to be a board member, to act primarily for the benefit of another in matters connected with the undertaking. So other contexts come up, if you're a board member for a for-profit organization, or if you're an officer for a for-profit organization, you have some fiduciary duties tied to that. If you are like a trustee or a guardian for someone else, you would have sort of fiduciary, trustees, fiduciary duties. Guardian, I'm not exactly sure, but it's going to be something like a fiduciary duty, right? So you can think of it as just that in this role, you are acting not for your own benefit, but for someone else's benefit. In this case, the organization, for the organization's benefit. So good faith, care in the best interest of the organization, primarily for the benefit of the organization. Loyalty is another one that gets thrown around. That you see it in some court cases. It's not in that statute. I've seen, if you're looking on, what is that website, like Board Source or something, you'll see the duty of obedience sometimes. That's in the, that's not a duty in Colorado. It's kind of like loyalty and care. And so just, it's really confusing, I think, the language, because it doesn't really mean what we typically think of as obedience, right? It's kind of like saying, it's like, it would be like saying you have to be obedient to your child because you owe them the duty to like feed them when they're hungry, right? Like, is that, you have to care for them is probably how more people would say it. So loyalty, care, good faith. How do you do it? How do you fulfill those, right? Well, you need to pay attention. You need to be informed, and you need to be taking certain actions that are in the best interest of the organization, right? And you need to do a reasonably good job of it. And that's key. You don't have to be an expert. You just have to do a reasonably good job, but you have to, be aware of certain things, be informed about certain things, be attentive to what's happening with the organization, and then react in a way that's in the organization's best interests to the best of your abilities, right? So, and then there's this loyalty piece. You need to stay loyal to the organization as well. So undivided loyalty and allegiance. What does that mean? Where do people get in trouble with this? Usually this comes up when someone either competes with their nonprofit somehow, or competes with, like, a lot of times you'll see it when someone's has a fiduciary responsibility to a company, but like someone competes, someone, the community foundation was looking to buy that building to have an office, and you go in and outbid them as a board member, that is, that's a pretty clear breach of your duty of loyalty to the board, right? If you're on the board of that community foundation, or maybe bidding on the same project, or doing business with the organization in a way that is kind of gives you an unfair advantage. You can do business with organizations that you are on the board of if you follow a conflict of interest policy. And typically, if you talk to a lawyer or you talk to an accountant or someone, they're going to tell you to do it. Make sure you're doing it for a below market rate, right? Because that's where that's it. That's an easy way to sort of show that you're being fair to the organization. But you also need to follow some other policies, like your conflict of interest policy, if you did that, right? If you can avoid it, best thing is to just not do it at all. But sometimes in these small communities, you really can't, right? You really can't avoid it. Maybe you're like the only printer in town, and the organization needs flyers. Like it's totally fine for you to print those flyers, but you can't be sort of like getting a sweet deal because you're you're on the board, right? You have to put your personal business interests behind the interests of the organization in that case, right? Make sure you're doing that. Care, right? What is care, right? If you're in charge of managing something, care is to be reasonably informed about the issues that require your consideration, to devote appropriate time and attention to the oversight of the organization's activities, and to act with the care that an ordinarily prudent person would reasonably be expected to exercise in a similar situation, right? And so this language is sort of pulled from like court cases, interpreting the statutes and talking about duties, and that staying informed, devoting appropriate attention, and in this care that an ordinarily prudent person would be reasonably expected to exercise in a similar situation. There's a lot of hedges in that sentence, right? But that sort of means you don't have to be perfect, but you need to pay attention. You need to make sure you have enough time to devote to this, right? And that you can give it the give it the attention it deserves, right? And if you can't do that, maybe think about not being a board member. Think about asking for help from other board members, getting more people on the board, or reaching out to some experts, which is a good idea anyway. Good faith. What does that mean? Honesty, faithfulness. These are just sort of different definitions that I've pulled. Observance of reasonable commercial standards of fair dealing in a given trade or business. That's sort of like in the contract world, but you can think of it like what's a reasonable standard to live up to as a director? What should reasonably be expected of you? Which I know is such a wishy-washy standard. So we're going to give you concrete things in a slide or two. In the absence of intent to defraud or not seek unconscionable advantage. So, right, that's what, don't use your position to, land all of the best contracts for your business or something. I think everyone gets this. I think everyone's trying to do this. I don't think there's any like secret sauce to meeting this one, except, just being a good person. So in plain English, stay informed, stay attentive, take appropriate action with the best interests of the organization in mind. I think that's the quick takeaway. And I see there's something in the chat. Does someone have like a really specific question? I don't know. Okay. All right. Questions at the end. That's what it says. Okay. So how do you ensure you're meeting these duties, right? What are some specific things you can do? So be informed, right? Here's the things to be informed about, like the organization's mission. What do you do? Important to know, right? And sort of that. And if you're a board, if you're an existing board member and you're taking a new board member on, you think about this stuff in your intake packet, right? Like how do you set them up for success? How do you educate them about what your organization does? Maybe like I'm on the board of an organization here called Gunnison Valley Mentors. And we're a mentoring organization. Everyone knows that we sort of like set up kids with one-on-one mentors, but we do a lot of other activities too that I didn't necessarily know about, even though I like volunteered with the organization, right? That I learned about as a board member because people educated me. Be informed about the organization's finances, and that means sort of learning how to read a balance sheet a little bit and a income statement. Learn about assets, liabilities. These aren't necessarily financial, right? But like, what property does the organization own? What sort of risk might the organization face? Know about the organization's performance. What are your metrics? How do you get those grants? What are the important metrics for your grants, right? Are you meeting them? How do you plan to meet them? How are you doing with fundraising? Being informed of all of those things and making sure the board is informed of all of those things, right? And then being informed about the organization's governing documents. And I think this is an easy one because you had the bylaws forever, and no one's looked at them. And it turns out, there are specific ways the board members are supposed to be elected, or something that people have, was in the bylaws. They've never been amended, and now you're doing something different, right? You need to run any organization according to the bylaws. If the bylaws don't match what you're doing, it's not a big deal because you can change them as the board, but you should change them. You don't just continue like that. Be attentive, right? Pay attention to what's the important things going on with your organization, the inflow and the outflow of money. Typically, when people get in trouble, it's because of something that relates to money. And that's true in businesses, nonprofit organizations. It's the root of all evil or whatever. Maybe it's not the root of all evil, but it's the source of a lot of trouble. So pay attention to that. Pay attention to your staff needs. What are you as the board, start governing an organization in the way that allows the staff to do their job. Operational drift. Operational drift is sort of what I talked about, those bylaws, right? You start off doing one thing. This happens with like everything that we always do. You drift a little bit. You always have a little bit of drift. If you have too much and you're not conscious of it, that can be bad, because then there's certain things that you've strayed far from the plan, and now you're doing something else, but you're still looking at the plan you had for this plan. So it's our broad category. Potential conflicts. So potential conflicts of interest with board members, with business dealings in your organization. New risks. Are you taking on a new activity? Does it entail some sort of new legal or regulatory risk or financial risk? And so relatedly, changes in the regulatory environment and changes in employment law, I think is a big one if you have employees, right? That's something that you need to keep up on and need to sort of have maybe just an annual check-in with someone like an attorney, or a lot of businesses actually solve this problem with like an HR service, and that's fine. But like someone who's sort of like paying attention to changes in the laws that affect your organization, and you should know which laws affect your organization. Employment's fairly universal, so that's kind of why I list it. Otherwise, it depends on what you do, right? then taking action. So regular meetings is a great way, right, to keep informed, to get those financial statements, to talk about what the staff needs, to keep up on what the organization is doing, your funding needs. And I think sort of a lot of things get smoothed over if you meet regularly. Adopting the needed policies. And so do you have a conflict of interest policy? Do you have a whistleblower policy? Do you have a forget what the other policy I always give people is when I set them up? I should know it off the top of my head, but I'm just blanking. But do you have the policies that you need in place? And these can vary for organization from organization, right? And sort of where you are in your growth. So when I set organizations up, I always set them up with 3 policies, the third of which I can blanking on, of course. And but as you grow, you might need more, right? And if you deal with kids, like, do you have a screening policy to screen the people who are going to work with kids? If you are investing any money, and you have an investment policy, these are policies. Those are 2 examples of policies that not everyone's going to need, but when you get there, you need to adopt some sort of policy and follow that policy to sort of be fulfilling your duties of governing the organization. Asking when you don't know. Ask, if you don't know something, ask this, and it's something the staff would know, ask the staff, ask the director, ask another board member. You've never seen the bylaws, ask for them, do it. You're a board member, you've got that power, right? You've got a lot of power sort of as a board, and so ask for the things you need. Seek counsel. So this is sort of the same thing, but outside of the organization, right? Financial, tax, legal advice. One of the things when you're a fiduciary and that sort of standard of care that an ordinary person would exercise is the law recognizes that we're not all experts, and we're not going to all be experts in everything, right? So, but what the law expects you to do is, if you're not an expert in something, to consult an expert, right? And sort of know when you should consult an expert. And if you don't know, maybe consult someone who's a little bit more experienced than you, or maybe consult an expert. Do you like, can you review this? Do you think, do you think we need anything here, or are we good? I have financial and tax in there. I think a lot of sometimes small businesses think of them as the same when tax is really like a specialized subset of finance. But maybe they get their taxes done. They're like, CPA did my taxes. I've got a CPA. I'm good on the financial front, because they're like a financial professional, right? But there's other stuff, and a lot of CPAs, I think nowadays, offer sort of what's called like fractional CFO services, right? And it's that other side of finance. Are you managing your cash flow well? Do you have do you have good financial policies? If you're holding customer data, are you protecting it somehow? All of that other side of finance that is not tax, right? Because you think of like a mature company, they've got a lot of finance guys in there. They got a CFO. They probably get an outside firm to handle their taxes, right? So they're doing something else, and it's not something that every organization needs, but it might be something you ask your CPA at tax time. Do you think we need these services? Do we need this sort of like outside finance expertise in how we handle our money, right? And then just being a good board member at those meetings, suggesting ideas, debating ideas, voting, making sure you're there and you participate. The whole idea of a board really comes back to democracy and the idea that we make this better decisions when we are as a group, right? And you get different perspectives. Different areas of expertise. But you have to bring that to the table and not be afraid to speak up. You need to participate to be a good board member. And then putting the organization's business before your own, right? And I think that's fairly simple, and we went over it. But being loyal, not seeking any sort of advantage by being a board member, or advantage by owning the only print shop in town, and your organization needs flyers. And let's see. Sorry. Do I have one more slide? No, hold on. And so with all that, I think, it's this thing that sort of, what do you need to do as a board member to fulfill your duties can be different at different times in the life cycle of the organization. It can be different for different board members. If you hold a role like the treasurer or the president of the board, those duties might expand and contract, right? And then what is particularly going on in the organization at that moment, and the duties are about what you're doing as a board member, not necessarily what is happening necessarily in the organization, right? So you could have an organization that's going bankrupt, and you guide that organization through that process and fulfill all of your duties, even though the organization is failed in a sense, right? You could come in as a board member into an organization that is sort of a wreck and doesn't have any policies, doesn't, their financials are all, all out of whack, and they haven't filed taxes in years, and you could still fulfill your your duties as a board member if you can sort of devote the time and care to fixing those issues, right? But that's what your focus would need to be on in that situation, right? And then the other last point I want to leave you with is that you can fulfill, not every board member is going to be able to do everything. So if you have, and I think like the community foundation, and there's some other resources, and there's like a board skills matrix, right? So if I'm the lawyer on the board, and someone else on the board of mentors has a whole career in finance. So, if I'm asking that person, hey, like, what do you think of this, whatever, this interest rate, or I don't know, something financial, right? It's okay to share that sort of burden as a board, as long as you're communicating about it and using those skills, right? And if you don't have the skills on the board, looking for it outside. But it is perfectly fine. Not everyone has to be an expert in everything. Again, that's part of why we have boards. And as you build your board and bring other people onto your board, it's something that really, I think, pays off to be conscious of what kind of skills are we bringing onto the board. Do we have someone who understands finance? Do we have someone who understands business, marketing, the law, whatever? It's great to have this sort of mix of skills on the board of any organization, so that and like those people might not want to advise the organization directly. Like it's a sort of a huge liability for me to give advice to an organization that I'm on the board of, legal advice to it. But I can, they sort of act like, if you have a friend who's a doctor and you're like, hey, do I need to go to the doctor for I don't know, I tweaked my knee, right? Those questions of do we, does this meet the threshold where we should ask an outside attorney or an outside accountant or seek some sort of, expert advice here. So yeah, I think it's, I think Maryo's and Kelly's presentations speak to as much to how you do this as mine, but that's I think that's the point, right? Is the duty is to do a good job and not mess things up. And sorry about the amorphous answer. So I will pass the torch to Maryo now, I believe, and I'm going to stop sharing. I'll stop sharing here.
Thanks, Will. And a reminder, folks, please feel free to keep putting questions in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. But Maryo, you're up with best practices. And you're muted. Here we go. One second for technical difficulties with the mute button. Here we go. There we are.
Great, thank you. Well, the major thing I want to say to you all is thank you. Being on a board is a significant commitment of time and passion. And without you, the good that your organization has the potential of doing can't be done. So I do want to repeat a little bit some of the things that Will said, but maybe in the context of the legal issues that he spoke of. So to carry out the legal responsibilities, to steward your organization's resources well, and to remain trusted by the people you serve, the donors, the community, there's certain best practices that boards really should be following. But before I start my laundry list, I want to point out that boards are, as Will mentioned, they're in different places at different times in their maturity. And the function of a board member changes depending on where they're at. So while there'll always be programs and there'll always be governance, no matter the budget size or the maturity of the organization, the proportion of those things may change. So an all-volunteer board may expect to be directly involved in programs like packing food boxes or administration, like stuffing envelopes, 80% of the time perhaps, or and then governance, like making sure that required documents get filed on time, or infrastructure for the future is being built maybe about 20% of the time. For an all-volunteer board, your plan might be an action-oriented one-year work plan, though it still needs to be written down. As organizations mature, the proportions change. So when the organization is at its peak of maturity, board members might expect to spend more than 90% of their time on governance, and program responsibilities might simply mean showing up at events and cheerleading in the community and participating in fundraising. So your plan for a mature organization will be more of a strategic plan, forecasting your evolution, activities, and budget needs for the 3 to 5 years in the future. So the first thing I would say to you is learn where your nonprofit is on its journey. This will help you know if your role is primarily governance or programmatic, but even if it's primarily programmatic, it doesn't mean you can ignore governance. If your organization is one of those very delicate places, and this is almost the most fragile time for an organization, where it's changing, where it's evolving from a program-oriented board to a governance-oriented board, in those years, your nominating committee is going to be the most important committee of all, because it'll be identifying the people with the new skill sets you need to enter a successful next phase of life. So I just encourage you to listen to my laundry list with these ideas in mind. If you're with an all-volunteer organization, definitely know your legal role, but don't tune out when I mention executive director or details of governance just because you're not there yet. Part of your job as stewards of your organization's mission and its future will be about building an effective infrastructure now, so that as you transition, the basics are in place. For example, your work plan might say in a programmatic board, by the end of 2021, we'll have adopted these 5 policies. By June of 2023, we'll have adopted these 5 policies. By December of 2023, we'll have got the funds to hire a part-time staff. Boards are the stewards who steer the organization towards a sustainable future by adopting sound ethical, governance, legal, and financial management policies, and making sure the nonprofit has the resources, which I include money, people, time, reputation, and connections to advance its missions. Lots of governance junkies, and I'm afraid I'm one, come up with adorable mantras for a board like the well-known 3 Ws. A board member should expect to bring work and/or wealth and/or wisdom to their board. I'm no different. I've created Maryo's 6 A's of best practice for you. Don't be discouraged if your nonprofit may not now have all of the policies and procedures I'm about to mention, but you can help your nonprofit gradually acquire them as the group matures. There's my 6 A's: your attitude, the actions you take, asset development and conservation, ambassadorship, appropriateness, and assessment. For attitude, I'm sorry about my screen view, but I don't want to take the time to switch it to a slideshow yet. It'll just take time. So you can figure out what's on that screen. Attitude, you need to have a passion for the mission, vision, and values of the organization, and the good and potential good that it can do. I'm sure you all have that. Otherwise, you wouldn't be thinking about joining your board or serving on it. Willingness to learn about the ecosystem, like food security or mental health, the big picture stuff, as well as the unique niche that your nonprofit fills. Maybe another group in the food security sandbox feeds toddlers better than you do. That's great. You want to support them like crazy. You don't want to duplicate what they do. You want to meet occasionally as an ecosystem to make sure that there aren't people being double served and others not being served at all. 2023 is not the time to be territorial. Willingness to invest time into work. Work, as I mentioned, may mean different kinds of things depending on the life stage of your organization. Early on, it may mean packing food. Later on, it may mean doing research on HR and employment law. A willingness to embrace your role as a board member, and an understanding of the delicate balancing acts among staff and board roles and volunteer roles, understanding and balancing the spirit and the letter of the law, and letting that consciousness guide you in navigating the many gray areas of reality. My A's for action. Before your first meeting, as Will said, explore the website carefully. Obtain and read the job description for board members. And if there isn't a job description for board members, maybe make that one of your personal goals for your first year to ensure that they are adopted. Read the most recent annual report, the minutes of at least 2 of the previous meetings, then at least skim the bylaws, the strategic plan, the budget, and the most recent balance sheet and most recent budget to actual. I would suggest you do that before you're seated at your first board meeting, so you come in with an organizational context. Also, before or at the very close to the start of your term, you should expect to sign a conflict of interest document and a confidentiality policy. Some boards also ask you to sign the job description of a board member. Start looking at your policies right now, whether they're in a policy book, a special place online, or in a single massive document covering everything. Get a handle on what you do have and what you don't, so that'll help guide your thinking during your first year. There's good governance and ethics practices that donors and funders want to see, and which let those people know that you are ethical, that you are efficient with their money, that you're effective in the community. So during your time in office, you should expect to attend meetings and plan your calendar around them. Some boards have policies that you can only miss X number of meetings in a year. Find out if your board does. You want to read in advance the board meeting materials, come prepared. Participate in meetings, ask for clarification, raise concern, contribute ideas, and speak up. As Will said, I can't emphasize that enough. You don't want to, even if you have the most fabulous executive director in the world, you don't want to rubber stamp them, because your role is to be legally responsible and to guide the organization. So ask questions, ask hard questions. Review the finances. Don't assume that finances, and Kelly will talk about this, are just the bailiwick of the treasurer and executive director and finance committee. You are responsible for them. And when it comes to finance, there's no bad questions. Don't be afraid to ask. You'll want to approve the job description, its salary and benefits for the executive director. You're responsible for hiring and, if necessary, firing that person. You have to ensure that there's a regular evaluation for that person. And you're responsible for making sure that the executive director follows your policies, and if not, to talk to them about that. You want to participate in planning. You're not only responsible for the now, but you're responsible for the future, that the organization is evolving well and vitally, so that when you leave the board, you pass it on healthy to the next group. It would be wise to ensure that there's a policy book. You know, it's that mantra, policies aren't policies unless they're written down. So whether there's a single policy book, however digital or paper it might be, or a series of policy documents, or a single giant one, you should have one. And with the follow-up materials that we'll be sending you, I'll send a couple of sample tables of contents of what the ideal policy book would have in it. And remember, you don't have to have it all right now, but you can say, well, we don't have policies about personnel, so let's work on those for the next 6 months. And then we'll go to policies about financial controls. When our community foundation looks at grant proposals, one of the things we ask is that you provide us your policy document having to do with money and financial controls, and who's on first about making sure that there's a separation of duties when it comes to money. So this isn't just Mickey Mouse. It's not just wise structural planning or wise governance, but it also actually, think of it as a way to help your organization get money. Funders who know that an organization is well managed and is following good policies are much more likely to give you money. And finally, learn things about your field and about nonprofit governance, which I have to say is evolving right now. Books about nonprofit management written 10 years ago are probably becoming kind of obsolete as people are rethinking what board members do. So maybe each board member could be responsible for pledging to read a single book, or attend a webinar, or research a topic about your field and governance during the year. So the next A is conserve your assets. Of course, money is the one we all think about. You'll want to donate something that's significant to you. There's some boards that have standards that to be on a board, you need to contribute at least X dollars. I don't think most boards do that. They say, because we want to have a diversity of perspectives from the community on our board. So most of them say something like, try to give what's significant to you. And that actually is not just a buy-in kind of thing, but funders look at that. A board that gives 100%, even if the amounts vary, is much more likely to be favorably reviewed by a funder, because the mantra here is, well, if they don't care enough about the organization, and these are the people who know it best, why should we? You want to participate in fundraising, which doesn't, a lot of people go, oh my God, that means I've got to go ask people for money and I can't do that. Don't freeze up if that's you, because there's lots of ways to participate in fundraising. You can write notes on the annual appeal letter, make thank you calls, since there's plenty of data that those personal touches matter. If you have a beautiful home, maybe you want to open it for an intimate fundraising event, Or maybe you could identify people who could be donors but now aren't. You could take friends who could be donors out to breakfast and tell compelling stories about your organization without even ever asking them for money, just setting them up. Or you could accompany the executive director on a fundraising visit, excuse me. And finally, review the financials and the budget. But conserving your people assets matters too. If you're the president, don't micromanage the executive director. This is one of the main reasons, if you look at surveys from any number of like community foundations or other funders, the main reason that executive directors resign is that they feel like they're being micromanaged by the board. If you're the president, the convention is that you are the boss of the executive director. If you're another board member, you are not. And the president is the point of contact between the board and the staff, and the executive director is that point of contact for the staff side of it. Of course, as president, you could empower another board member to work with the executive director on X, Y, and Z. That's great, but the president needs to have a handle on that. And if you're not the president and you're another board member, please don't serve as kind of the sounding board for the executive director if they're having problems with the board. It just confuses everybody's roles. You're going to want to ensure that there's a personnel manual that lays out procedures, but also acknowledges the well-being of your employees and make sure that they're able to have adequate mental health days. My God, the mental health issues here are tremendous. And we all know that the more people are able to work in a meaningful way within a good environment, the more productive they'll be and the more effective your organization is. Do your best to make sure that the staff is paid as well as possible. See what benefits you might be able to provide. There is Shelley Popke, when she was the executive director of this Crested Butte Museum, used to say that a number of nonprofit boards were raised with the idea that they should ask, how little can we get away with paying somebody? And the right question, especially now in this valley where costs are so outrageous for so many people, is what do we need in order to ensure that our effective staff members stay with the organization and cherish working here? You want to make sure that the staff structure is the best one for getting the job done. Structures change, of course, as organizations evolve. Make sure that job descriptions exist and are realistic, include performance goals. Even though the only staff that the board reviews is the executive director, you're giving guidance to the executive director of what you expect from the whole staff. Another asset we tend not to think about is the asset of time that you need to conserve. So you don't want to adopt a plan that's not realistic. If you identify deliverables that'll require the staff to constantly work weekends and ignore their families, or if you have fundraising goals that simply can't be met this year, you're setting the organization up for failure because your staff may burn out. And you want to recognize the time that a given plan is going to take when you adopt it. If you have a big plan that simply must be adopted without dropping anything that's current, it's your responsibility to find the funds to hire the staff or contract personnel or find a way to get it carried out. You want to make sure that the staff has what they need to be effective and efficient, the right structure, the right software, the right office environment, the right equipment. And you don't want to waste anybody's time with unnecessary meetings. The one thing I believe that is true of everybody today is nobody has time, and you don't want to dishonor people by wasting that. Next, A is you want to serve as ambassador. When you're in the community, remember you will wear a board hat. You want to represent the organization positively with warmth and excitement, talk up the great things you do, because the better your reputation in the community, the more you sort of have a good reputation kind of in the water, the more receptive donors, government or other community organizations, and prospective new board members are going to be to you. And remember that what's said in a meeting stays in a meeting. If you disagree with what's been said or what's been agreed, keep it quiet and private. Talk about it freely in the context of a civil discussion within the board, but don't take it outside. Be appropriate. This is a really tricky one, especially as organizations move from programmatic boards into more policy and governance type boards. Roles are really important. Kind of the short version is a board sets policy. The director is responsible for carrying out. Of course, the lines are never really that clear cut, but that's a general rule. And so micromanaging how the director carries out your policy is outside the scope of your role, unless you're in a board meeting or unless privately, if the executive director seeks your advice. And the hat thing is really important. Sometimes you're a governor, sometimes you're a collaborator, and sometimes you're a volunteer, even if you're called board member. When you're in a board meeting, you're a governor. A governor is an organizational steward. It doesn't make you the executive director's direct boss. That's the president's job. If you're a committee chair or a committee member, you're really more of a collaborator with your executive director or the staff member who's designated to work with that committee. And if you're coming in to stuff envelopes or pack food boxes, you're a volunteer like any other volunteer, subordinate to the staff member who's giving you the guidance. So the hat thing is sometimes the hardest for board members to kind of decide, am I a governor? Am I a collaborator? Am I a volunteer? But remembering which role you're in at any given time, I think, is one of the keys to being a great board member. And finally, the last A is assess. Some questions you might want to ask. Do you know where your nonprofit is in its life cycle and what that implies? Is your nonprofit playing well in the sandbox? It's your particular ecosystem, complementing, avoiding duplication, supporting, coordinating, or even collaborating with others as appropriate. Does your nonprofit express the impact it wants to make and track in a systematic way whether it's making that impact? Does the president or the appropriate committee evaluate the director? And does the board review and approve the evaluation? Does the board have a process by which it assesses its own performance? There are tons of samples available. And as with all of the stuff I've been talking about, if you're looking for samples, we can provide you some. And a great source is called boardsource.org, I think, which is just one of the key go-to places to find out what great governance is all about. Finally, does the board have a process by which concerns that might be surfacing in the self-assessment are addressed? It's a great time to see if your life cycle is evolving. And as it does, you're going to need new skill sets in your next wave of board members, because you're not only asking, is our bus headed in the right direction right now, but also, are the right people on the bus for the new direction it's headed in? So as I wind up, I'll just say, in the follow-up materials we're going to send you, there's a couple of fabulous books on very practical kind of workbook things on life cycles, how to identify where you're at, what are the big issues and the big pitfalls and the big opportunities of an organization's given place in the cycle, the kind of skill sets you might need. We'll send you a link to principles and practices put together by the Colorado Nonprofit Association, which is a great kind of laundry list of things. It's kind of a version of what I've just said, but a little bit more formal. We'll send you a couple of sample tables of contents for a policy book. And a lot of people say, well, we're not sure what a good fiscal policy document would look like. And there's a great DIY one that we'd be happy to provide you. So with all of that, I'm going to stop sharing and hand it off to Kelly. And then, as always, glad to take questions after she's done. Take it away, Kelly.
Okay, let's see if I can share. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. I have so many screens open. Here we go. Can you all see this? hopefully if I put it on. Now, how's that work? I can't tell what you all are
That's
seeing.
great, Kelly. You're good.
Great.
Okay, perfect. All right. So two things before I get started. One, I think I saw that Ryan White is on this call. Ryan was one of my students when I taught at Western. He was an accounting student. So I was super excited to see that he's somehow involved in the nonprofit space. And the second thing I wanted to say before I get started is I think we probably have a mix here in the audience of folks who maybe sit on nonprofit boards where they're primarily volunteer. So that sort of life cycle thing that Maryo was talking about, where maybe you as board members handle a lot of the financial reporting responsibilities yourselves. And then some of you where you have staff, or you might even outsource the financial accounting and reporting. And so there's a variety here, but what I'm going to share is applicable to everyone, regardless of sort of where you are in that life cycle. And I'll do my best not to read the slides because I think they're being sent to you all and you can read them. And generally they're pretty, my slides tend to be pretty self-explanatory, but I just realized I am on the wrong slide to start. Hold on, figure out how to go back. There we go. So first, let's talk about the role of the board as regards your financial duties to a nonprofit if you're a board member. And let me start out by saying sometimes I say trustee instead of board because or board member because we have trustees, so I use those interchangeably. So if I flip and say trustee, I mean you all as board members. I'm not going to read these, but I wanted to highlight a couple of things. One of the things that's really important, I think, in your role as a board member with regard to the finances of the nonprofit is that whatever you're thinking you want to do programmatically, whatever vision you're setting, whatever direction you're setting for the organization, there has to be a financial plan that's reasonable that supports that. And I know Maryo and Lauren and others on the call can probably regale you with stories of the number of times that a board or staff goes away and someone's going to handle fundraising and someone else is going to like prepare the budget and another group is going to plan the programming or events or whatever outreach it is that you do. And you would be astonished at how often those three activities and those efforts don't come together, right? And I see that probably most often with regard to development and finance. And what happens is a board will sit together and there's lots of great plans and lots of great ideas. And those are all worthy, right? Because we're all working for worthy missions and we believe in what we're doing. But then the directive goes back to staff or a committee or a subset of the board. So like, oh, figure out how it works financially, right? And bring us back a budget and we'll rubber stamp it and approve it, right? So the first, like if you don't take anything away from today, from the finance piece, what I'd love for you to take away is that finance and development always have to have a seat at the table when you all are making programmatic plans. And it can't be the things that you sort of squish into the box and make fit after the fact, right? And so if you look at the slide where I talk about the role of the board, a lot of these sort of suggestions that I have on here that for you to think about how you frame your role from a financial perspective are really around making sure that finance has that seat at the table and that the financial implications, not just for the short term, but the long term, are being considered every time you think about what you're doing programmatically as an organization, right? Now, you can only do that if you are thinking through those. And if you have, if it's a program you've done before, what did it cost you in the past, right? So you're going to have an accounting system underneath that sort of supports that financial decision-making and that financial planning. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But really, I think your primary responsibility as a board is to make sure that, from a financial perspective, is to make sure that finance really has a seat at the table. There's a couple of other things that I think are important. I see this happen a lot. And as someone who was a CPA for a really long time, and I've sat on boards and who's been in a lot of board meetings for the last 15 years as a staff member, all too often, there are people on the board who are really great board members. They're devoted to the mission, they're great volunteers, they're good advisors, they're good volunteers, but they worry that they don't really understand finances, right? And that they, that maybe they don't even understand it or deal with it in their personal lives because they have a spouse or a partner or, an accountant who handles all of that for them. And let me just tell you that it doesn't have to be so complicated that you all can't figure it out if you feel like you're in a situation where you don't understand it. And that goes back to the point that Maryo made, which is ask a lot of questions, right? So there's no excuse for you as board members to not sort of dig in and understand what's happening financially at your nonprofit. The other thing that I'll say before I move to the next slide that I think is important with regard to your financial role at the board is if you are only getting financial reports that consist of numbers and there is no narrative attached to that whatsoever, fix that tomorrow, right? Whoever is preparing those financial reports for you should understand what's happening with the numbers, and they should be able to convert that into written text that's a narrative for you of some sort. It could be a PowerPoint presentation, it could be a summary paragraph, but just throwing a whole bunch of numbers at people in a meeting is like the least effective way to enact financial governance, in my opinion. And I see this happen a lot, right? Because everyone's going to hone in on a different number. Like if you're giving me spreadsheets with a whole bunch of numbers, what's important? What do you want to draw my attention to? So whoever's preparing your reports, whether it's an accountant or the treasurer or a committee or staff, ask them over time to start giving you some context and some analysis with that financial report if they're not already doing. And here's where I'll really pick on the CPAs and accountants. CPAs and accountants have this bias where we all think, well, we're just going to give you all of the numbers and then you can interpret them and figure out what to do with them, right? Well, I'm a CPA or accountant who doesn't think that's really the way we should handle it. I think it's partly our job to point out to you what are important trends, what's worrisome, what's doing well, and tie that back to and reconcile that back to our operating plan or our strategic plan and what we said we were going to be doing. So you can probably tell it's a little bit of a high horse that I've been on lately, is accountants just giving lots of numbers to people and expecting them to do something with it. So I'll get off that high horse and move on. All right, so I thought it might be helpful for you all as board members to understand, what does a financially healthy nonprofit look like, right? Some of us probably have experience with what a healthy personal financial life looks like, or maybe you have a business that you run and you know what that looks like when it's financially healthy. But the nonprofits are slightly different and kind of operate a little bit different from for-profit businesses, certainly our personal financial lives. So what does a financially healthy nonprofit look like? And really, there's two big things that you need to take away from here. There's what I would call kind of the process and qualitative side of things, and there's the quantitative side. Now, on the process side, a financially healthy nonprofit needs really robust systems, controls to make sure that whoever's in charge of the money or whoever has access to the bank accounts, isn't the only person who writes checks and looks at all the bank statements. Someone else is looking over their shoulder to say, hey, let's make sure money is not being defrauded. And I won't put Ryan on the spot, but he'll remember that when we taught accounting ethics at Western, one of the things we talked about is that people rarely steal from a nonprofit or any organization because they're bad people. That just really is a myth. People steal because they're in untenable circumstances, right? Or they'll borrow with the intention of returning it. And Maryo, could you hold up your fingers? Because I know a few, how many nonprofits just in the last year, last 10 years in the Valley have had unfortunate situations where money disappeared because there weren't sufficient internal controls. I can think of at least two. You probably know of more, right? So this does happen even here in the Gunnison Valley. And it's all you have to do is make sure that whoever is writing the checks is not the only person looking at the bank statement. It's the cheapest and easiest way to make sure you have some level of controls in your nonprofit, right? So you have to have processes in place to capture financial information, report the financial information, and then make sure that your assets, whether it's cash or other kinds of assets, aren't disappearing, right? So that's the qualitative kind of process side. But then there's the quantitative side, right? So what does a healthy nonprofit look like financially? And I think this really came to light during the pandemic, and some of you who are leading or were sitting on boards during the pandemic in the Valley saw the importance of having really robust cash reserves during the pandemic, right? Because all of a sudden donor money dried up, or your operating revenue dried up because you couldn't hold your events, or maybe grant funders were pulling back on commitments, right? And so, the pandemic was a great example of the importance of having a robust set of reserves. Now, every time I give this talk, and I've been doing this for like 15 years, I feel like I can feel everyone and see everyone's eyes rolling, because you're the nonprofit that's so small that there's no possible way that you can ever generate cash reserves. And that's just not true, right? And so what's the best way to generate cash reserves? You budget for them, right? You plan for them, right? So when you're planning your budget for the year, you say, okay, we're going to spend, we estimate we'll bring in $120,000, and we're going to spend $110,000. What's the $10,000 difference? That's money at the end of the year that's a surplus that you can put into reserves for that rainy day fund. Or if a great opportunity pops up for your nonprofit, you'll have some resources there, some savings, if you will, to pursue those, right? So no matter how small you are, I promise you can generate a reserve as long as you budget for operating surpluses, okay? A lot of people ask me, they're like, oh, well, I'm nonprofit. That means my budget has to zero, like net zero at the bottom. That's so not true. Like, if there's one myth I wish we could get rid of in the nonprofit sector, it's that. Like, how are you ever going to get okay, so let's think about our personal finances, right? If I'm making $2,000 a month and I'm spending $2,000 a month, how am I ever going to get ahead as an individual, right? Same thing for nonprofits. The other thing I hear is that grant funders or donors don't like to see that you're generating a surplus at year end. Well, that's just not true in my experience. Maybe there's some old holdouts that are crazy, but honestly, you don't want them. Like, you don't want them in your universe if they don't want you to be financially healthy, right? So it's absolutely true that you can generate a surplus. Just have a plan for that surplus. We're putting it in reserves for a rainy day. We're saving it. We're saving up to buy a new building or a new vehicle, or whatever it might be. Because donors, and like, we have really large reserves at Rumble now, and I expect people are going to ask us what those are for. Like, we're getting ready to go into a huge capital campaign and big projects, so we need a lot of cash on hand. I can explain that away, right? And then the other thing that I see that with regard to what a financially healthy nonprofit looks like or doesn't look like is people tend to really overestimate how much revenue they're going to bring in for the year. Like, they're just like insanely optimistic, right? So here's my really sweet trick for this, okay? So you don't get yourselves into trouble. When I propose a budget, that budget is really realistic, right? And we live within our means. And if we don't live within our means, then the board needs to get out and start raising some more money. I'll just be honest with you all. And I say that, like, I've been on boards too. I've had to do that, right? So you live within your means, but if there's more things you want to do, have a separate part of your budget proposal that says, you know what, if we're really successful with that event, or if we get that extra grant that we're not sure about, here's what we're going to do with it, right? Now that can be complicated because sometimes you've got to have enough runway to plan and sequence things, but I always have a little wish fund that's part of the budget proposal. If we're really doing well, here's the other things we're going to do. And here's when we think we might know if we're doing that well. And that fits and gives us enough time to implement those activities or buy those things or whatever. So I hate it when I see budgets that are just wildly optimistic on the revenue side that are just unrealistic, but no one's really willing to confront the reality of what it costs to run your nonprofit and your hopes and ambitions and reconcile that with what it takes to run it. So again, I won't go through these in detail because they'll be in the slide. You can read them later. One last thing I will point out though, that I wanted to go back to something I said at the beginning. I have on here that says budgeting is an organization-wide process. Right? Again, it's not just the bookkeeper, it's not just the ED, it's not just the treasurer, that you really need buy-in. I was just saying at the beginning of the call before you all jumped on with the other advisors, we're budgeting right now at Rumble. Our staff's been working on it for 2 weeks. We're probably still going to be working on the budget proposal for at least another week before it even goes to the finance committee and then onto the full board. Now we're large and we have a lot of complex things going on, but the reason, like I could put the budget together in one night, right? Like I could get the numbers together, but I'm building buy-in with the staff. We're really understanding the trade-offs with what we're trying to do. We're really making sure the board understands the opportunities and risks in our budget. And that all takes time. And it takes all the people in the organization working together. And then guess what? We have a really solid budget. It's a good projection. It's a good plan. And then next year when things go haywire, like they always do, we all understand why it went wrong, where it went wrong, and we can work together to resolve that. So I really feel strongly that it has to be an organization-wide process. All right. So the other sort of thing, that cautionary note that I see that, with nonprofits and financial management, and for those of you who are either doing this as a board member, you're planning cash flow, or those of you who are like you're reviewing it because staff is doing it. I see cash flow projections that are just like bonkers, right? And like, so here's a couple of things that people do. Like they'll spread insurance, like normally insurance comes in, your insurance bill comes in quarterly or annually, right? But they'll take like a 1/12 of it and put it in each month. Well, that's not how your cash flow is going to work, is it? Right? You're going to have to pay that bill when it comes due, either quarterly or annually. So that's one that I kind of see. The other thing that I see, which is super unfortunate when it happens because it's an expensive mistake, is if you're on biweekly payroll, someone's in a hurry, the treasurer's trying to get the budget done before the board meeting, and they'll just take, there's 2 pay periods each month. Well, don't forget, if you're in biweekly payroll, there's 2 months out of the year where you have 3 pay periods, right? So make sure you're budgeting that way. And then make sure you're clear on when grant funding might be coming in, because I think some of you, based on your titles for your organizations, it looks like are probably pretty heavily grant funded. Make sure you're thinking about when those grant payments are really likely to come in. And one of the things I'll note is that with a pretty divided Congress for the next 2 years, like we get a lot of government money, and we front a lot of expenses and then get reimbursed. We're anticipating government shutdowns over the next 2 years, right? And so make sure if you're dependent on a lot of government grant revenue, make sure that you're not going to get caught when Congress shuts down the government for 6 weeks while they try to resolve some issue. So, all right, we already talked about cash reserve, so I'm not going to go through that. And like, I'm a huge fan of the budget. Actually, I'm not a fan of the budgeting process because it's hard and I have to work weekends and that's not great. But I think the budgeting process is the key really for a successful nonprofit from a financial perspective. It is the framework in which you can have hard conversations about what you can afford and what you can't afford, and how much money you want to save and what your future plans are. And so I put a slide in here that shows what, sort of, I think is a very simple, like high level framework to follow when you're going through the budgeting process. And it really is built on that idea that everyone in the organization needs to be involved in the budgeting process. And I have a sort of a note that I've highlighted at the bottom of the slide, which says, make sure you're practicing income-based rather than expense-based spending. Let me explain that because that might not be clear. When earlier I said you need to be very careful about not being too optimistic on your revenue projections, and that's true. However, you don't want to be like so nervous, Nelly, that you're underestimating what's going to come in. Because remember, why are we all here? Because we believe in our missions and there's really important work to be done. So make sure that you're looking at what you can really bring in, what's realistic, and make sure your expenses kind of match to that. All too often I see people be too conservative and they're just like, on the one hand, they're too conservative and they're like, oh, we can't do any of that stuff and we need to accumulate a ton of money and we need to be super conservative. Well, you're not really fulfilling your mission, are you? Right? Or the extent of your mission that you could. On the other hand, I see people who are like, well, that's just what's going to cost and we'll figure out how to pay for it. So I call it here internally income-based spending, but I wanted to clarify what that meant because that may not be very clear to you all. And then I think this is my last slide. Yeah. So really, I started out talking about how I don't want you all just looking at a bunch of numbers on spreadsheets. I really want you thinking about what your financial reporting looks like. And this is important for you internally. It's important for your stakeholders, like the people you serve, your donors, your grantors. Maybe there's government stakeholders where you partner with governments to achieve your mission. But I think this is a really good framework for rethinking your financial reporting, if in fact it is that kind of financial reporting where you're just looking at a bunch of numbers. And so I do want to walk through these super quickly, and I know we want to leave time for questions. First, make sure you're thinking about what your key performance indicators are. Now, you might look at me and say, well, obviously it's just money. But no, like key performance indicators for you financially could be, what's your overhead? What's your FTE, your full-time equivalent on payroll? How many tickets are you selling? How many volunteer hours are you anticipating to pull off your mission, right? So don't just think about key performance indicators in terms of actual dollars. Think about what's really happening with those activities and what you want to capture and measure those things, volunteer hours, number of tickets sold, those kinds of things, and report those alongside the financial impact. Because if you can give that context to you as decision makers, as the board, or to stakeholders like funders, it's just a much more powerful understanding of how the organization functions. Make sure you're capturing your data in a timely manner. Do not wait until July of the next year to finally put your financial reports together for the previous year. I know everyone is volunteers, and I know it's hard to make that happen, but make sure you're getting financial information in a timely manner. And when you are preparing financial reports, think about whether they're for an internal audience, an external audience. Like, you wouldn't prepare the same reports hopefully for staff or for a board as you would for a funder, right? So think about who your audience is and what they need to know. And then finally, I really think that I love sitting in a role where I oversee finance and development, because to me, they go hand in hand, because I use the financial information to tell a story that enhances the story of all the good work that we're doing, right? Because if you're telling a good financial story, you're enhancing the credibility of the organization, right? So hopefully you'll walk away today feeling like your financial obligations aren't just to produce a balance sheet and an income statement, but that your financial reporting and your financial processes actually present a huge opportunity to tell your story in a way that really enhances your credibility with your funders and with your other stakeholders. And I can tell you from personal experience, all the best, everyone has great missions, right? Like we all do. One of the things that sets the financially successful organizations apart from the others are the ones who are really convincing their funders that they're credible, and the financial story is a way to do that. So I'll stop. That was really quick, but I think, are y'all sharing contact information too, Maryo?
Yes, we are, Kelly.
Yeah, because people may have questions. I'm always happy if you email me. It may take a day or two to get back to you, but don't hesitate to reach out if any of this seems confusing or too fast. I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Kelly and Maryo and Will, for all that information. And the contact info for all three of them is going to be at both the end of the slideshow that we'll share, and I will also include it in the follow-up email. And we do have a little bit of time here at the end for questions. Steve, I noticed that you had a back and forth with Will in the chat there with a question. Did you get that question answered? Did you have any follow-ups on that? Okay, looks like we're good on Steve. And then, sorry.
The one, that's obviously I would need to know a lot more to answer any specific questions, but that's sort of a general answer. The one place I see people get in trouble with this stuff, there's a couple of exceptions. If you're an officer in any way, and like sometimes small businesses, small nonprofits, you might be a board member and an officer. Officers, like there's certain tax liabilities you aren't going to get out of. If you withhold employment tax and then don't pay it, government's coming for you. And then the other area I see small business owners get into trouble with, I've never seen in the nonprofit context, but I see this all the time with small business. people start an LLC and then they, a lot of lenders are like, you have no credit history. So we want someone to personally guarantee this. And so then you sign a personal guarantee and yeah, you're good. You are on the hook for the money, right? So I've never seen a nonprofit where a board member signed a personal guarantee for something, but there are some ways where you sort of like, there's this corporate structure that protects you from liabilities, but there are some ways that just completely go around the corporate structure and make yourself personally on the hook. And so, those are just things to be aware of. Like if you're signing something, make sure you're signing it as a board member, or really like probably the executive director should be signing everything for the organization as the executive director and not in their personal capacity, right?
So Will, let me ask you sort of a devil's question that a lot of people ask me. Some people say, well, we've got directors and officers insurance, so I'm protected from everything, and that kind of absolves me from my responsibility. Could you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, with any sort of insurance, right? It's only as good as the policy limits and exclusions. And I would say to read that policy very carefully. And really, I like to think of directors and officers insurance as it's the pay for legal fees too, right? And those can get pretty big pretty quick. So even if you have no liability, if there's like a halfway credible claim against you and someone can just make a court case last for a year, that could eat up your whole coverage on your D&O insurance, right? So that is something you really have to look at that coverage and understand that coverage and sort of think about what would be the cost of a lawsuit here. But yeah, I wouldn't advise not paying attention to the thing. You have insurance for a reason. And there's certainly, I'm not super familiar with like the exclusion, like the typical exclusions that would be in a D&O policy for a nonprofit, but it should be a belt and suspenders thing, not I'm good, I don't have to pay attention type of thing.
We do have a couple more. Kelly, while you were talking, Will asked, what counts as in the bank? For instance, if a nonprofit has grant funding that will be distributed throughout the year or over the course of several years, do those funds count as in the bank?
And so, Will, can you explain that just a little bit? Do you mean like how much can you count on those, or should you include those in your budget?
Yeah, well, you had that point. You had about begin the fiscal year with at least half of the year's funds in the bank.
Yeah. So so
reserves.
what I meant was like literally. So this goes back to the idea about the reserves, right? So in an ideal situation, you'd have 3 to 6 months of reserves, cash on hand, like not like we're waiting for stuff to come in, right? But over years, you've built up those reserves by carefully budgeting for surpluses, so that you start the year with at least that 6 months cash on hand, right? And then you're not at the mercy. What was it? I think Steve's question down here. How do you plan, when your revenue for grants and donations, as an example, can be so fluid and kind of go through these cycles? So really, like, I think the key is those reserves, right? That the more you can start the year with that money in the bank because you've saved it from surpluses from previous years, then you're in a stronger financial position, and then you're not subject to the whims and mercies of, your donor pool or your grant funders quite as much. It kind of mitigates that risk just a little bit. Does that answer your question?
I guess I'm thinking of if you've already won the grant, you've been awarded the grant, but it just gets dispersed over time. So, how do you, it seems more secure than some other types of accounts receivable.
Yeah, I think it is true, but I think it's also, here's where I see that kind of go sideways. If, you generally, like, it's rare in my experience, and maybe you're familiar with other organizations where you know, those grantors just send that check regularly. Usually you have to file some kind of report. You have to do something to request that money, even if it's already been awarded to you, right? And so I still think even if you're in a situation where you're really confident that you get a lot of your money is, you know, sort of a sure thing, you still could have to manage cash flow depending on how the reporting shakes out or how quick that agency is promising, you know, is processing those requests. Like, you know, we got stuck a couple of years ago during the government shutdown, actually, because one of the federal labs, just like none of their finance staff, even though the money was appropriated and it was exempt from the payout, like they didn't have the staff to process the payments.
Mm.
So for 2 months, we were sitting on like 90 grand of receivables, right?
Yeah.
And so I just think you have to be careful. I mean, and again, what I'm pointing out is the ideal. So I don't want anyone to feel like if they're not there, that they're falling short somehow, right? But, you know, ideally you'd have those 6 months of cash in reserve. But Steve, you're asking a question about, you know, how do you really plan your budget when your sources of income can be so unpredictable? Is that kind of what you're asking? Yeah, like that is the hardest thing about being in a nonprofit sometimes, isn't it? Other than managing people, that can be really hard too. But a couple of things I'd say to you, and I don't know your situation specifically, but so here's a couple of things to think about, and I'm happy to talk with you separately. If you have a lot of ups and downs year to year in what you're getting in terms of individual philanthropy, so this is, you know, donations from individuals, then I think you have to be conservative in what you're going to expect will come in. But I also think, this is going to sound counterintuitive, you probably need to look at what you're doing philanthropic, like what you're doing with your development team. And again, like you're probably like, I don't have a development team, it's me, right? Like I don't know what your situation is, but you know, in my experience, and I've been raising money for a long time now, it's pretty rare that you see huge dips year to year, unless there's like one-time gifts that are somehow factoring into that. If you're taking care of your donors, if you're really stewarding them, if you're really working that development process, you probably shouldn't see huge dips unless there's like one-time gifts. Like here's a strange thing about Rumble. We get bequests every year, and we don't even have a legacy giving program. We've just been around for so long, and there's so many former alumni and students and others who have gone through, we don't even know we're in these people's wills, and we'll get those every year. Well, I've started treating those completely separately from the budgeting process. You know, I don't look at how much money we raised this year in unrestricted money and then budget for that. I'll look at it and say, okay, how much of that can I count on coming in this year realistically, right? So I think that's important. But also you may have an issue on development that we could talk about. But grants can be a lot harder. And so I'm generally pretty conservative on grants. We don't get as many grants as Rumble, but when I was in the arts, we got grants all the time. And I was pretty conservative on budgeting for those, unless I knew that I had such a strong relationship with that grant funder and they were so committed to what I was doing. So I think you have to be kind of conservative. It sounds, Steve, like that idea of like, here's the core of what we know we can do, and here are the things we're going to do when that money comes through, might be a good approach for you, but I'm happy to talk separately. And then Maryo answered the question about reserves. More and more I see funders thinking you're not sustainable and credible if you don't have reserves. Now, 10 years ago, that was really strange. Like I actually lost a grant 10 years ago because they said we had too much money in reserves, and we didn't even have 6 months in the bank, and we had a huge budget. Like it wasn't at Rumble, it was somewhere else. But like, they're like, oh, you're sitting on too much money. I'm like, we just went through a financial crisis in 2008. Did we learn nothing from that? Like, I don't understand, right? But more and more, like I'm actually seeing that it's an expectation that you have reserves. Is that what you're seeing too, Maryo?
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I think, you know, how much is being encouraged to be in reserves is sort of a fluid thing. I mean, a while ago, it was, we hope for 3 months. Right now, people are saying it would be prudent to have a goal of 6 months of reserve. And I do have to say that the organizations during the pandemic, when everybody shut down, I would say 2/3 of the nonprofits here got through only because they had robust reserves. So it's really important. And a brand new organization isn't going to get 6 months of reserves in the first few years of their life.
That's right.
But you want to have a goal of what you can do and a policy of how you can get there. And that's the important thing, is showing funders that you're on the way to a goal and you've got a plan for getting there.
Yep, I agree with that. And it's also the inflationary environment is so ridiculous right now. I mean, it looks like it might be cooling off a little bit, but you know, we got slammed this year because we didn't anticipate enough inflation in food costs, and we run a dining hall for 12 weeks out in Gothic. And I mean, that added 30,000 to our budget. Like, it wasn't insignificant. So,
Kelly, on that note, like, if you're sitting on 6 months of reserves, is it prudent to invest it in something that's like a bond ladder, or some sort of cash equivalent or near cash asset?
yeah, that's a great question.
What are those kind of options?
Yeah, so I think for the first time in my adult life, money markets are actually paying 3% now, right? Like, so to answer your question, I'll tell you how we're handling it. For the last number of years, we've just been sitting on that cash here at Rumble, right? And it's not an insignificant sum, because like the interest is just nothing, right? But we also weren't sure when we were going to need it, so we couldn't tie it up in a bond ladder, right? And so even if it's a sort of a short ladder, but right now we're actually looking at putting and that's part of the reason, one of the things I'm doing with the budget process is how much can we afford to kind of skirt over to Vanguard and get into a really nice money market account. So I would have said in the last couple of years, don't even waste the mental energy on it. But now, if you're sitting on reserves, I would definitely talk to your treasurer or bankers or people you know, because you don't even really need that much to set up institutional accounts at some, Vanguard or places like that, and you can get a decent little return for a period of time, because every little bit helps.
Yeah.
But I'd be careful about locking them up in CDs or other things that where you might need them. If you're really comfortable you're not going to need it, by all means, but whatever you do, don't invest them in something where you're going to lose the principal.
Sure.
Awesome. We are a couple minutes over time, so I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up this evening. If you find yourself with burning questions in the middle of the night about board member things, feel free to email me and I will pose those to our presenters and get you an answer. And as we stated, we will be following up tomorrow with materials, contact info, the recording from today. Appreciate you all making the time to join us this evening, and have a great rest of your night.
And thanks for being board members.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care.